It's no secret, people love the classics. There are all sorts of people who admire vintage toys, classic cars, and retro video games. So it should come as no surprise that photographers admire classic, groundbreaking cameras. The Canon AE-1, the Nikon F4, just a few cameras first introduced in the 1970s and 80s that still remain relevant to this day. While those classics still teach us so much about the art and patience of photography, what will digital cameras of the past teach us? Will they be looked back on in 20 or 30 years with such fondness? Consider this, many photographers actually prefer the classic film process over the modern digital workflow. Working photographers can still shoot film and find success. Sure, it isn't exactly the norm, but it certainly can happen. So if all that can be said for the classics, what can be said about the early generation of digital cameras? Well, you know what the pros say.
I've always said that it doesn't really matter what kind of camera you use.
I always say that the gear that you have doesn't matter when it comes to content.
Of course, it still needs to be said that you don't need lots of fancy gear just to take nice images, blah blah blah.
It doesn't matter.
Let's put that to the test, shall we? You're watching Sweet Lou Photography. Thanks for tuning in. Before you is the Sony CyberShot DSC-P200. Catchy name, I know. First released in 2005, this little point-and-shoot packs an effective 7.2 megapixels. The camera also sports a Zeiss Vario Tessar lens with a maximum aperture speed of 2.8. The aperture is not fixed, however, meaning you lose several stops of light when zooming in. Speaking of zooming in, the camera has a built-in 3x optical zoom, a focal range of 7.9 to 23.7 millimeters. Though, since this camera boasts a CCD sensor, the effective focal range is 38 to 114 millimeters. So at its widest focal length, the aperture sits pretty at f2.8. However, zoomed in on its tightest and you're set all the way down to f5.2. Did I mention this camera has a control wheel? You have several shooting modes, including a full auto mode, program mode, manual, movie, and of course, playback mode. There's also a scene mode, which presets the camera for various shooting conditions, such as nighttime or the beach. There's a built-in flash, a tiny viewfinder, flimsy buttons, and fiddly menus. It also has a tiny low-res LCD screen to review your photos on. It's certainly nothing to write home about. And how could we forget Sony's very own memory stick? The perfect format to be just annoying enough to require an adapter. Fortunately for me, my PC's card reader could handle the format. Regarding the memory, you can store a ton of fine quality JPEGs. Cards fill up a little bit faster if you're shooting video. No raw shooting options available though, unfortunately. All of this can be yours for roughly $30 to $60 American on eBay. But enough with the specs. What can this little camera do? I first took this camera out to Norwalk. I didn't glance at the user manual at all beforehand. I figured I would just throw the thing onto manual and figure it out as I went. This was, unfortunately, not the case at all. The manual controls are odd. Maybe it's because I'm used to my modern cameras having dedicated knobs and dials for all my controls. In order to adjust the shutter speed and aperture, you have to first press the middle button, then adjust the up and down for shutter speed and the left and right for aperture. It's a very odd system. I suppose there's really nowhere else you could sneak these features onto the camera with its limited real estate. Focus is slow and sometimes inaccurate. You can hit the menu button in manual and program mode to bring up and change your focus settings. The camera allows you to use multi-point autofocus, center autofocus, which I found to be the most accurate, spot autofocus, as well as a variety of fixed focusing distances. While you can't manually focus in the traditional sense, you can use one of these predetermined focal distances to pre-compose a shot. This sort of zone focusing can be great for street photography. That said, if you're trying to shoot something in the moment, the semi-manual focusing presets are clunky. You'll undoubtedly miss those golden moments if you're too busy fiddling around with the menu system, simply trying to pull focus. Not the most practical implementation, in my opinion. Let's talk a little bit about pushing this camera. In my experience here, the second you're out of good light, the camera falls apart. High ISO performance is incredibly weak, which to be fair is expected of a camera like this. But what I find more concerning is the fact that when on auto or program mode in lower light, the camera dramatically slows the shutter speed, making it incredibly difficult to fire off a usable exposure without being on manual mode. And let's take a brief moment to talk about the video mode. It shoots MPEG VX files at 640 by 480, with your choice of either 16 or 30 frames per second. And just so you get an idea, this is how small the videos are, compared to the 1920 by 1080 media you're used to consuming today. My first impressions were grim, but I can't just make a review of a camera, shooting on the thing once. After messing with the P200 at home a bit, I had some revelations and fully understood the controls. I was ready for my next mission out. Since Norwalk seemed to be a bit of a bust, I figured I would take the P200 around with me during the work week and shoot a bit in the evenings. With the long summer days and sunsets by the water, it was the perfect backdrop for some photo walks with my lady. Once you begin to get used to the odd controls in this camera, you can actually take some pretty nice exposures in the right kind of light. Ergonomically, the camera is a joy to walk with. It's so light and fits nicely in the hand. I will say, I typically enjoy the weight of cameras like the 5D Mark III, but it's refreshing to be carrying something that's legitimately lighter than my cell phone. It wasn't all peaches and cream though. It was on this trip that I noticed a pretty big issue. The viewfinder is fairly inaccurate. ImageResource.com cites that the P200 has a viewfinder that only covers between 80 to 84% of what you're actually shooting. On my third trip out with the camera, I hung around my hometown, the Bronx, and what better place to go than the Bronx Zoo? It was a beautiful day, perfect for some leisurely shooting, apart from a close encounter with a leopard. This was the first time I really felt like the P200 needed to be able to zoom in further. The animals within their exhibits were sometimes simply too far away to even come close to filling the frame. It was also here where I noticed that the autofocus has a lot of trouble detecting the subject. You'll notice in these shots here that the camera seems to focus more on the fence rather than the animals behind it. When shooting on the P200 next to the A7S, it becomes really evident how simple the little camera can be. As cliche as it may sound, the P200 really started to remind me of the simple joy of taking pictures. It was also on this trip that I realized I hadn't charged the battery of this camera once since I first got my hands on it, and it was just a little under half charge. Pretty impressive. Most recently, I took the P200 out to the city, on a trip to the Empire State Building, the 9/11 Memorial, and to have some drinks with some friends. Atop the Empire State Building, I managed to take some pretty nice shots. I got really lucky and met a gorgeous model on the 86th floor. What are the odds of that? With the striking views of New York City, I snapped off quite a few shots. I will say that the P200 really prompted me to chimp far less often than I would with my DSLRs. I think this is mainly due to the fact that the LCD screen is such shit and the images don't load up in full resolution right off the bat. I know that sounded like a dig on the camera, but honestly, chimping less and shooting more is really important to me. It really is nice to just focus on shooting and enjoying the moment you're experiencing. I also learned a really important lesson. Apparently, your height doesn't really matter in Pokemon Go. On the 86th floor, I was able to catch this guy. While the P200 might not be the most stunning camera on the planet by any stretch of the imagination, I had a lot of fun shooting on it. Apart from the convoluted manual controls, the camera is a breeze to pick up and just start shooting on. The image quality is pretty good if you're shooting in the right scenarios. But don't sell your 5D just yet. Your cell phone still probably takes better pictures than the P200. The detail simply isn't there in certain environments, and forget about anything in low light. Here's a couple of pixel peeping examples to show you what I mean. ISO performance is pretty bleak, but that shouldn't come as a surprise to any of you. On the subject of ISO, one of the more annoying things about the camera is the fact that it doesn't track the changes you make to ISO. Rather, it continuously reverts to 400, at least on this particular copy of the camera. So I noticed upon review that some of these photos were taken at ISO 400 when I didn't even intend them to be that. And of course, ISO 400 is the highest ISO this camera can do, giving me pretty poor performance on some of these shots. Ironically, the camera does handle moire pretty decently though. The colors the camera capture are pretty nice. Weirdly enough, some of the bokeh in the shots taken at f2.8 almost have a film-like quality to them. The manual focusing system is clunky, and it's impractical in my opinion. Some street shooters might find use of the predetermined focusing distances, but for my style, they're simply not viable. The decisions the camera makes in program and auto mode are crazy too. The slowdown in shutter speed makes it a no-go. You can't effectively use this camera on program or auto modes unless you want the flash going off every other shot. The video mode is unusable in this day and age. Too little control and too small of a frame. But I think more importantly than anything is the fact that I just had a really good time shooting on this. I mean, even after I finished testing it out for this review, I ended up shooting with it anyway in certain scenarios, even during the eclipse recently. I genuinely enjoy the camera, and honestly, I'll keep using it despite its imperfections. Would I shoot a wedding on it or a corporate gig? No, but that's not really the point here, is it? The fact is, it's hard not to be passionate about just shooting around if you truly love photography. So should you rush out and pick up one of these today? Well, the answer is probably not. I will say this though, if I saw one of these at the thrift shop for $5, I'd probably pick one up. Hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been Sweet Lou Photography. I'm going to try and do some more videos of this nature in the future. And by the way, coming at you live from the P200.